Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ancient Warfare Magazine podcast. My name is Jasper. We've reinforced the team today. Joining us are, as usual, Marian and Myke. And at the buttons, our producer is Angus Wallace. But we have a guest, and his name is Mark Backhouse, and he's the author of a new war game called Strength and Honor, which tries to, I don't know, well, I guess we'll establish that, whether it's simulate or just give an impression of warfare from the, I think the Caesarian period into the Antonine period. Mark, is that right? I think you probably should introduce it a bit.
Broader than that, yeah, from sort of the time of Marius's reforms, if they even took place or not, from what's that, about 105 BC through to, about sort of Septimus Severus, so about 200 AD, something like that. So it's the time of the, I suppose, the sort of cohortal legion, I suppose. Again, something open to debate, I suppose, but about 300 years in.
How does it work? I mean, we have to assume that not everybody here is a gamer. People just enjoy reading about ancient warfare.
Sure. So what it is a set of war games rules. I suppose the idea behind it is that people can get together with armies of model soldiers and refight some of the epic, huge clashes of the Roman world inside that time period there. It's a game, but it's also, I suppose, got quite a strong element of historical background to it all. So the idea is to replay and refight some of those big battles there and see if you can do better than the real historical generals who fought inside the battles.
And if you say model soldiers, what should we think of?
Well, I mean, traditionally, most people might be familiar with the sort of figures you might get from Airfix kits or from a Games Workshop, possibly, and many battles are fought out with those. But in the case of my battles, the rules are deliberately based around smaller scale figures. So in Strength and Honor, a lot of the photographs inside it are based around figures that are 2 millimeters tall. So you won't really see individual figures as much as the big formations of soldiers, your legions formed up inside your your three lines, your triple axes, or your big mobs of warband soldiers, and sort of big masses of troops. However, it can play up to bigger scales as well. It can actually be used in any scale at all. And many people will be playing in either 2 millimeter scale or 6 millimeter scale, which is figures being 6 millimeters tall. That's a scale of about 1 to 300 in terms of like human height size to the size of the figures.
It's a macro game rather than a micro game.
Yeah, absolutely. The focus is very much on big, massive battles in this period here. You'll find that a lot of the other war games rules that are out at the moment for ancient battles focus on much larger figures who are about sort of, an inch in height. And you'll maybe represent an ancient battle like Pharsalus, for example, with 300 or 400 figures per side inside it. And deliberately what I've done is I've tried to focus it down on much smaller figures and try and get a sense of the much broader battle itself taking place and focusing much more on the formations that a general might see rather than individual soldiers and their uniforms. I'm not really fussed inside my war games rules about sort of which helmets they're wearing or which shields they've got, or the types of greaves they're wearing and whether or not they'll fit into that exact period. We're looking here at a much bigger, broader sort of eagle-eyed sweep of the battlefield, almost as if you're sort of that scene inside the film Alexander and you're like an eagle flying over the top of the battle line there, or like playing Rome Total War maybe, or something like that, in which you really get to see big formations.
So what kind of formation are you in control of? I mean...
Well, I suppose what I've tried to do inside it, I've tried to... see it from the perspective of a general, and in most of the accounts that I've been reading, written inside ancient sources, the focus has to be very much on what the individual legions are doing rather than what each individual cohort's doing, or particularly which set of centuries and what they're up to. So the focus is very much on moving sort of groups of soldiers around about the size of, I suppose later on in periods it would be a sort of brigade in size. So that might be maybe a legion or a large group of sort of tribal allies who are grouped together by a sort of a chieftain, an enigmatic chieftain or something like that there, or a large group of maybe a couple of thousand cavalry squadrons, maybe grouped together in one unit or one formation. So you very much see it as sort of big units of soldiers brigaded together rather than sort of small individual regiments. You're looking at a much bigger macro scale impression of what an army might look like and how a battle might be fought.
So a two-part question to that. I'm a big wargamer and have played many different systems of rules. I don't think I've ever played the camera pulled that far back, right? Of course, many of the popular systems we played have been skirmish level or even operational level. So my question to you is, what motivated that decision to work at that broad level? And then the second question is, how then, when the camera's pulled that far back, does that affect the gameplay? Like, I'm imagining it plays very different than, say, a DBA or a FOG or something like that.
Well, in some ways, it's inspired a little bit by DBA. DBA, for those people who are unfamiliar, is a game in which you have sort of 12 elements per side, which represent a sort of an ancient army inside it. And then Strength and Honor does have a similar sort of size of scale to that. The difference is, instead of sort of four figures representing maybe a big group of soldiers, we've literally got sort of 4,000 or 5,000 Roman legionaries potentially shown on the basis there. I suppose the idea behind it was to try to get away from micromanaging the battlefields. And often as wargamers, what we want to do is we want to be the Julius Caesars or the Alexanders. And at the same time, we also want to be the local centurion commanding that century, making those critical tactical moves at the key moment. And of course, the reality for most generals inside battles, I suspect, inside the ancient world, was they had very little understanding of what was going on at that small local tactical level, because they probably physically couldn't see it on the battlefield. It's going to be a battlefield in which they can probably see a few hundred meters either side of them. There's going to be a lot of dust, there's going to be a lot of noise, there's going to be a lot of confusion. Or maybe on a hill, they might get a slightly better elevated view of what's going on, but they might not have that sort of ability to be able to deal with small, localized tactical situations and respond back to those. And obviously lacking sort of modern communications. In many war games, people tend to want to be able to instantly react to different things that are going on. And what I wanted to do was try to step back away from that a little bit and try to create a degree of simulation of what a commander might be able to realistically control and have some impact over, and really where things are out of their control and they can't micromanage those things. So that was the attempt to go with a larger ground scale, but also just from a visual perspective, by going into the smaller scales, I wanted to create that sense of the epic. And unfortunately, using the bigger figures, quite often 300 or 400 people having a fight, let's be honest, is less than a cohort's worth of actual soldiers in a real Roman battle. So suddenly to try and recreate Philippi or something with 17 or 19 legions aside or something seems almost sort of farcical, really, in terms of representing that and getting a real visual image of how large these actual encounters were, which I think is lost sometimes, and I thought it would be nice to do something quite different and focus on that very different challenge. And I hope to make that stand out from other games maybe a little bit, with that deliberately stepping back and creating a different way of seeing the battlefield.
Yeah. Not to mention you need an aircraft hangar to actually put
this is the other thing. I played some wonderful games actually with 28mm figures. One of my friends is called Simon Miller, who plays he's written another great set of rules actually called To the Strongest, which are fantastic. But he has 28-foot long tables. He needs a forklift almost to move all his armies from place to place. He's had to dig out a cellar underneath his London house just to provide room for his figures that he's got. And he employs 3 or 4 professional figure painters to paint the legions and the figures he needs for his battles. And unfortunately, I don't have that economic background. And I realise that most gamers won't have that either. Just even the sheer logistics of getting to the club, to play a regular war game on a Thursday night, it's wonderful for me to be able to pick up 90,000 soldiers inside one box, grab it, off the shelf at home, and then get down to the car and get out to the club and play a game and get a conclusion. Whereas putting all those figures out there, it's a stamina exercise in itself, worthy of a Legion force march. So
you have to be an expert in military logistics just to get to play a game about military logistics.
I was going to say, otherwise it's Saturday you set up the board, Sunday you thought about what you were going to do, and then by 10 o'clock Sunday night you moved your first movement let's all come back next week.
This is hopefully the joy of the game, and that I'm hoping that in about 2 hours you can play a large titanic struggle from the ancient world, and you can get a conclusion in which you thought, "God, that was a close run thing," or that really felt like a real battle, without having to pack it all away at the end and spend hours wearing it. Most people have got a finite amount of time, finite storage, and just in terms of their attention span as well. I think probably if you play for 8 or 9 hours, I think it's going to be something that I think a lot of people will be struggling to cope with for that length of time. So I wanted something that was straightforward and simple enough that people would grasp. They could play in a few hours. They could have fun with their friends, feel like they've actually had an experience which maybe captured some of the elements of what an ancient battle might have been like there, and come up with a fairly historical outcome. So that's been sort of the purpose behind it, really, and playing those smaller scales.
Does the player occupy a specific role? In a lot of the games that you play, or that I have played, the player they're almost like God. They're not a specific general. They're all the generals, or they're all of the centurion level commanders. In your system, is it similarly omnipotent, or is the player occupying, like, having the limits of being a senior commander, having to get orders out, experience a delay, line of sight, those kinds of things?
Sure. Well, what we've got inside the system is we've got a way in which you sort of emulate the command structure inside the armies, and each side is given a number of command points that can be used and utilised by the armies, which represent not just the commanders' orders being sent out, but also the individual sort of unit commanders, the commanders of the legions, if they even did actually have one commander. That's another open to debate thing there. But the individual officers then inside the cohorts, and then using their initiative and grabbing hold of those key moments of the battle to exploit those. And of course, inside a war game, it's not going to be entirely based just on your commander's decisions, then your troops randomly going out and rushing at each other. There's got to be a degree of control you've got to have as a player, else it doesn't become an exciting experience. It just becomes, an exercise. Once you've set them off in the right direction, you're only going to maybe get 3 or 4 key choices into the battle if you just purely play it as the general itself. So there's a degree of influence there you can take, and you can use those command points then to influence other moments inside the battle there, which hopefully allow a slightly more organised army, which is maybe a little bit more experienced or able to act in unison together at the key moments, or seize the right moments there to hopefully capture the initiative. So yeah, there's a degree of compromise there, Myke. There's no doubt about it, but I think there has to be, to an extent, to create a game which will keep you engaged rather than it being a foregone conclusion once the initial plan has been set out. I'm not sure that how much Ancient Commanders really got an influence throughout the battle, once it actually got going.
Are you saying you've eliminated the min-maxer? I mean, that could be quite controversial.
Well, it is controversial, possibly, but I like controversy. I'm no stranger to that at all.
You say you can't power game Strength and Honor? Oh no!
Well, you can. You definitely can. You definitely can. I'm sure somebody out there will do it, but it's deliberately been designed as a game which you can have fun with your friends to try and recreate these battles rather than as a competition set of games. Naturally, of course, the wargaming community is very competitive in some places, and the first things you get asked are all these points and things outside. Do these work perfectly? And how can I max out my army and make them all elite veteran legions or something to win every game? And I said to them, well, on the army list is, if it looks a bit cheesy, then it probably is. So try and use history as your basis for it there, and I'll provide you some guidance to try and get something that might look roughly right. But of course, if you find a historical precedent somewhere in the campaign you want to recreate, then you could throw the army list in the bin and say, right, I'm going to base it around this particular campaign. And that's fine, of course, as well. I'm hoping that people with a bit of interest in ancient history, like our listeners here, will enjoy looking at the army lists and making them right, and for the campaigns they want to recreate with it.
We're getting into the mechanisms, but which we all like to do because there's a lot of gaming content in the people who are actually at this podcast for a good reason. But I think for the readers of Ancient Warfare, I think the big question is, one of the things that we probably say most on this podcast is we don't really know, and that is often followed by a but, and then we, come all the exceptions or the bits that we do know. But I mean, obviously, when you're when you're designing a game, you can't tell the players in your rule books that, well, we don't know how this works, so I don't know, roll a dice, and every time it's different. How does that work? How do you go about from reading about the history to, filling in the blanks, really, because you have to?
Yeah, I think you've got to compromise in quite a lot of things there and make quite a number of assumptions, I think, inside ancient battles about how they were fought. And I think you've got to try and get your best guesses in places, haven't you, to try and get something that looks and feels like the accounts that we've got of ancient battles, so that you get a plausible outcome that looks similar to what you might read about if you were going to read some ancient sources of Roman battles there. So you're trying to capture out there some of the elements that you get inside, ancient sources describing, what the battles were like and the key moments inside them. Now, of course, those accounts might be of, dubious historical accuracy and might be flawed in many places, but you're trying to recreate, I suppose, as many of those, key features as possible inside the games. So in particular, inside the rules there, I was really keen to try and make sure that the armies were going to be deploying inside a sort of a historical way that looks similar to the accounts that we've got of what a Roman or one of their many opponents at battle lines might look like. And you've got to try and then think, how can you make sure that actually Roman armies aren't deployed in some sort of a strange shape or backed up in some huge great big column. You've got to try and think about, if you look at the battles inside the period, most of the time they tend to form inside one or two sort of battle lines, one behind the other. You tend to have your best troops on your flanks and that kind of thing, your elite troops on your right flank there. It's just a case of just trying to make sure that there's a benefit in the rules by trying to stick to some of the historical tactics and methodology that the armies used, I suppose. So you give them benefits inside the rules to encourage people to play things more historically. But of course, the problem with wargaming is that invariably people want to have control and choices inside the game rather than just repeating the same thing over and over again. And part of the fun of wargaming is trying out those what ifs. What if you do something a little bit differently? And so it's a case of trying to get the flexibility in there that you can try other things there. And there's more than one way to fight a battle. But obviously, if you're trying to use more historically based sort of tactics, you've got to sort of try and reward people for at least sticking with something that seems fairly sensible and based on the sort of evidence that we've got, rather than sort of going out on a limb and doing something completely different.
So, and this actually raises a really good question. You're probably familiar with Philip Saban's Lost Battles work. I know it's pretty legendary among wargamers. One of the things that, when I bring up the topic of war games as a real tool for study, right, that to ask and answer questions that can guide our understanding of ancient warfare, at least among some of my friends, I get a lot of pushback, right, that it's not even less useful than experimental archaeology. And we all know what reenactors come in for in the scholarly community. So do you view, what do you think of that, wargaming's usefulness in really advancing our understanding of ancient warfare from a scholarly perspective?
I think from a scholarly perspective, I think it can give you an insight into what's going on, but you've got to be taking it all with a pinch of salt inside it. Ultimately, what I'm not trying to do is I'm not trying to create a game in which every single detail of ancient world and ancient battles are being recreated, because simply the more complicated it becomes, the more detail you want to go into. Quite often, actually, the less effective game it actually becomes, and actually you tend to lose yourself in the fine detail to such an extent that you actually miss the bigger picture. But I think it can give you some benefits in terms of looking and understanding maybe particular key features inside a battlefield site. Probably more with more modern battles and ancient battles, where we could be more sure about the actual topography and the troops involved inside. There is inside the ancient world, of course, a lot of the work we've got is based around a sort of degree of speculation about battlefield sites and the units involved inside the battle and how the battles were fought. It's quite difficult to actually maybe get that. I found probably the ones which have really helped me from a scholarly point of view, although I'm no sort of academic really, have been when we've done more sort of Kriegspiel style games. in which the decisions have been given to us in a much sort of more blind way. You don't even visually see the troops on the tabletop, but you have there's a situation described on maps to you, and there's a lot more a fog of war, I suppose, in terms of what you see. As you say, that the danger might potentially with the figures on the table game is that you do still even have that godlike sort of view across the battlefield, even if you don't necessarily get the chance to control your troops in the same way as inside a computer game like Rome Total War. You can still sort of you still have got a much better idea. Whereas if you play a more traditional Kriegspiel type of game, you find that you genuinely do get some of the challenges of the command decisions, maybe without the same horrible consequences inside a real battle. But nonetheless, I've certainly felt the pressure of a Kriegspiel game in which I've been asked to make very tricky decisions, and the time's been against me. And in fact, Jasper, you were involved in one we did a while ago with Richard Clark as well, weren't you? In which we were struggling to work out where on earth these damn enemy were coming from all the time, and trying to divert resources into lots of different directions. And I think that was quite a useful exercise, just in terms of realising the real challenges that commanders face, particularly without sort of modern communication methods, and trying to work out what on earth's actually happening into the battle.
Follow on to that. Is that fun? How is that from a gaming perspective? Like, so in the Kriegspiel scenario where you're describing this, like absolute chaos and blindness, which, you know, I is my experience of war, having been in service for most of my life. So that's your gaming experience, and that's, we'll admit, very unusual. I think most of us who are veteran war gamers, we do that. We have the God's eye view for most of our games. So is it fun? Is that a satisfying game? Scholarship.
Kriegspiel has been just as fun as a figure game. There's a very different experience to it there.
It's more of a role-playing game, I think. When you talk about Kriegspiel and ancient wargaming, I think Kriegspiel is, well, obviously it's going to give you an idea of how difficult it is to know where the enemy is, and maybe about moving your troops across the battlefield. But it's, in a way, maybe so generic that you wouldn't, you know, if you're playing a game set in a certain historical setting, I think you want to have some kind of idea that you're playing that era. And if you remove artillery from Kriegspiel, you might almost, you know, for how you play the game, because it's very much black box like, which is part of the fun. You know, you talk, or, you know, you try to talk to the people who are on, you know, in your command structure, but, you know, but it's all up to the referee, what messages get to them, what comes back, and in that respect, it can be, you know, it can be stressful and in a good way, hopefully, and exciting, but it gives you maybe a lot less of a sense that of I'm playing, you know, I am now Julius Caesar, and, you know, I guess, I don't know, Mark, can you play your game with multiple players, and can somebody be Mark Anthony?
Yeah, no, we've done one based around the campaigns against Sextus Pompey, actually. So that was good fun, and we played that with various different commanders and different sort of fleets of ships and legions based in different places, and people with sort of different political challenges given to them, as well as sort of military challenges. And therefore, you know, the commanders were very keen on maintaining their gravitas and their popularity, as well as winning the victories on the battlefield. So we've done some quite fun ones with that, and yeah, I think certainly in terms of just some of the challenges, of the logistical challenges of trying to move around big bodies of troops, and some of the different obstacles that might be in the way, and that kind of thing. I think that was quite an interesting experience. Whether or not it actually accurately reflected what these campaigns were really like, of course, is open to debate, really. But I think that we certainly attempted to capture some of the challenges you read about when you're reading through your your different ancient sources, and getting them onto our campaign system. So I think that was okay.
I think it's an interesting one because the role playing, tabletop role playing, obviously, again, you generally you control an individual with stats, and you are interacting with other individuals with stats. And so the interesting thing there is obviously that controlling troops is much more the realm of computer role-playing games, whether it be a unit or the general. But the interesting thing from the role-playing perspective is obviously as a character, you have a certain range of parameters, which are normally the whole system, whether it be D&D or Call of Cthulhu or any other role-playing, tabletop role-playing game. So you actually play within those rules for your character, and you roll dice based on what your charisma or strength or intelligence are, and you are guided by the dice for that. Whereas I think it's interesting in the tabletop war game where I am Julius Caesar. It's a sort of a vague concept of, well, I'm Julius Caesar, as opposed to defining by dice gods who Julius Caesar is and rolling accordingly. And
it's always a pre-allocated character, Murray. It's no different.
Well, absolutely.
Yeah,
but in the sense of, in a role-playing game, obviously your pre-allocated character is also bound by dice rolls. Whereas I think in a war game, your pre-allocated character is bound by your imagination, and you can justify breaking character based on, well, I've lost it completely, and I'm devastated by the death of my son at the Battle of Carrhae, so I break all the rules, I do everything wrong, which is absolutely fine. Whereas, and I think it's a really interesting the role playing meets wargaming / what kind of role playing, what kind of wargaming are we talking about? Because to me, it's almost one of the great things about this is that you've got this fabulous macro scale game, and if you want to, this is something that the readers could do if they want. You can zoom down. You can zoom down into a skirmish game where you're now only controlling a century or and then you can zoom down even further and go, now I'm an individual Roman legionary, and here's my character sheet, and this is what I'm doing on this battle. So I've tried to do that role playing wise. I put some of my role players, so there's only 5 players. Not even a tent group in Roman warfare, but I've put them in a role playing game where they're in the middle of a shield wall, and I had the best time ever because I had all this understanding of the bigger scales of the war game aspect of that. I did another one where I put them in an archery line at Agincourt, and they didn't kind of get. They're not military historians, so they weren't getting all the bigger scale stuff. They were just getting the role playing stuff. So it's a really interesting exercise, I think. But the gaming experience is a very different one because obviously you're controlling your individual, and whether they live or die is your sort of raison d'etre, as opposed to your army winning.
The thing that is interesting about it is that individual decisions can affect the strategic camera in battle. The example I'm thinking of is Pydna. This is 167 BC, and if you remember, I can't remember if it's Polybius or Livy or maybe even Plutarch's description of the battle, but we know that in the end, it's the decision of individual centurions not to wait for orders and to rush to contact inside the Sarissa hedgerow, right? And these are individual decisions being made that winds up, that combined with the phalanx being drawn onto broken ground. But it really is the decision of individuals to act on initiative that winds up breaking the line, the Antigonid line, which has, that has ripples throughout the entire phalanx. And I don't know if it's epic to the level that you're representing in Strength and Honor, but it certainly impacts the battlefield strategically. Is there any way that in Strength and Honor you're able to capture, one like Warhammer Ancients is a great example of this. Look, as an historical wargamer, I certainly have my beef with Games Workshop's design. But one of the things I think that the Warhammer, both in its fantasy and historical elements, has done well, has captured the ability of individual charismatic and heroic persons to impact the strategic outcome of a battle. Does Strength and Honor have a way to account for this?
Well, there's absolutely no reference whatsoever to heroic individuals inside the game. They're lost inside the ether of the battlefield, really. But when you get those extreme dice rolls or something strange happening there, I suppose what you've got to do is you've got to try and imagine that narrative and think about, why might that have actually taken place there. You do get a few strange moments inside it, in which if you roll a double 6, for example, when you're trying to rally your soldiers there's a moment in which all your boys sort of rally round a standard or something, and you get to throw away one of your setback cards, which is one of the symbols that your army is degrading. So sort of individual acts of bravery there can take place at key moments there, and maybe just throw a few quick surprises inside there. But by using the dice inside it, you will get some rather strange outcomes at times that might make you raise an eyebrow and think, well, hold on, why has that happened there? And as a player there, you've got to use your imagination a little bit, because you might not see the individuals actually carrying out acts of heroism or that little bit of initiative from that brave cohort that's stood in the way and stopped the Legion from being annihilated and kept open a small gap that's allowed the rest of the Legion to escape back to safety and reform again. But, you just got to try and recreate that with a little bit of imagination and your own reading of ancient sources and your imagination of what a battlefield's like at this point here. So it does sort of help to create a narrative of events there because of the randomness of the dice. Of course, you tend to get typical sort of results when you roll dice most of the time. You don't want these extreme things happening all the time, but just once in a while, when those odd rolls happen, you've got to try and picture how on earth has that taken place there? What has created that event? So hopefully that does sort of recreate it there. The generals also get a chance to influence the battle at key moments. And again, we talked about command points there being used. The individual generals can spend also command points at key moments in the game there. So, for example, if a legion has failed its discipline test and therefore it's falling back in disorder, or maybe even potentially if it's a really awful dice roll, routing or something like that there, you could use the generalship's inspirational sort of moment there to ride in front of them and try and hold the troops up from routing. But you only literally get a very, very, very finite number of those, and most generals will only get one opportunity to play that key moment of trying to, change the battle with their generalship.
That's Caesar grabbing a shield and working his way to the front line.
To the front of the sabers, for example. Yeah, absolutely.
And coming back to Mike's question, I mean, to be fair, I mean, the individual, the general, as a general, you cannot predict that your individual centurion or tribune is suddenly going to take the initiative and do the right thing.
Absolutely.
That's just lucky.
But also, how much would actually the general get to see those individual acts of heroism? Now, of course, we know the Roman army enjoyed, putting extra big plumes on the helmets and showing off, and sort of hopefully your generals knew each of the individual centurions by name or whatever. But, inside the mass of a battle, with 40,000 people on your side fighting, how many of those individual acts of heroism are you going to be able to see? Well, we obviously get a few of them being recorded down and, brought back to us. You get the classic one from the, is it from Octodurus? Is it from Pullo and Varenus, fighting outside the camp there against the Gauls? And there's another one outside of in Tharsus, isn't there, with the centurion leading forward with a devotio and getting stabbed through the mouth or whatever. But these sort of individual acts of heroism are sort of few and far between. I'm sure there are a lot more brave acts taking place in these battlefields that never got a look in whatsoever, and the poor guy was hacked down without anybody actually recording down their feats of valor. So you had to be one of the lucky ones who got spotted and picked out by your mates, to be remembered in that way there.
Even worse, you died a heroic death and then they assigned it to some other guy. You're like, no, that was me, not him. He didn't die that way.
It's funny that, because you were talking earlier on about reenactment before we came on air, and I was in that Hastings reenactment in 2000, and at the end of that, about 3 of us all claimed to have all captured the Wessex Dragon Standard, and we did all capture it at the same time, but we all had our hands on it. But I think about 5 or 6 of us all claimed to have killed the person holding it. And then afterwards, we all sat back and went, well, hold on, was that actually the Wessex Dragon Standard, or was that, the one from the other group of soldiers who were there, on top of the hill with housecarls in the middle of the battle line? And afterwards, then we all decided actually probably none of our accounts actually probably made any sense if we wrote these all down and somebody read them back in 100 years' time. The account of the battle would have looked pretty confusing and a load of nonsense for a few of us, frankly. So
that's exactly what we have to deal with in the ancient sources, because I think that's we're talking about random events. All of the battles that are memorable have some random event in them, like the phalanx becoming disordered. That's not how phalanx is designed, and
my favorite being Kino Cathale, where they just blunder into each other in the fog, and nobody wants to fight, and it just turns into a general engagement completely randomly. Yeah.
So that in that regard, dealing with them not going to plan is exactly the way ancient battles fought. And of course, the other problem with saying we're going to refight, the Battle of the Teutoburger Wald, for instance. Well, I'm not going to enter the forest. Well, I'm not marching. No. Because there's kind of like, well, I know what happens. I'm not going to do that.
Yeah, I mean, in fairness, the battles really are designed into the game, not for the sort of the strategic sort of level. It's very much at the point in which battle has been chosen. The armies have lined up, ready to face each other, and it's more sort of big pitch battles rather than a sort of a drawn out campaign-based battle. So you wouldn't be, creating Beth Heron Pass or something probably over. 2 days of retreating back with your legion being shot at by Judean rebels or something. What you're doing here is you're focusing very much on those sort of big pitched engagements where for the last 2 or 3 days they've been lining up outside the camps there and waiting for the other side to come out and fight. And then on this day here, they've decided the gods are with them and they're gonna go for it. So that's very much what the focus is on.
That is a question. I mean, how can you incorporate stratagems into battles, of which Murray is great expert. Talking about Pharsalus, can you allow say Caesar to have that that extra line of cohorts behind his light infantry, so the Pompeian cavalry suddenly goes, hey, where did these guys come from? Without the Pompeian player knowing this is going to happen, and I'm not going to throw my cavalry away.
Yeah, well, during the game, like I say, you've got these command points that you can utilise. So what you can do is you can strip off your rear cohorts of some of your legions there to form new bodies of soldiers by expending some of your command points. But like I say, you've only got a finite number of these points. So as the game goes on and as the battle sort of deteriorates, you can start off with quite a lot of control over your army, able to maybe deliver a few of these cunning stratagems if you're a Roman commander, or indeed potentially a barbarian commander of some form. However, as the battle goes on, you're going to lose these command points, and generally the battle's going to deteriorate down into a bit of a bun fight in which really, command and control is lost the more and more it goes on. So hopefully you can capture some of those elements inside it. You can have flanking marches of troops which arrive in the battle or as reserves later on, or you can have hidden ditches or ambushes inside the game as well. So some of those elements there you can capture, Jasper, inside the game using the rules, and some of the scenarios that we've got involve surprise troops suddenly jumping out from somewhere. So, for example, inside WSS magazine, Wargame Soldier Strategy, we had one last month or so, didn't we? A month or two ago, all about I'm going to pronounce this badly now, but Aquae Sextii. Have I pronounced that badly? Probably have.
I think
that's pretty good. So Marius has obviously potentially got his 5 cohorts of legionaries hidden away for the second day of the fighting there, and you can spring those out and to surprise the Germans, the Teutones or whatever, and that can be quite a shock. So hopefully inside the game, a lot of the scenarios we've got inside it, which we've already pre-written, have got some of these stratagems built inside them. But of course, if you're a creative player who enjoys reading their history, which I'm sure our ancient warfare readers are, you can hopefully bodge together using the rules that I've set out inside the rule book and create your own scenarios with a little bit of imagination and a little bit of thought going into it beforehand, and capture some of those key elements of the battles that make them a little bit different from a straight pitch battle.
I think for our non-English listeners, bodge is to make up on the spot.
Yeah, exactly. To improvise them. Yeah. Probably not make up on the spot. Prepare them beforehand, but yeah, you're making them up.
What's the scale and scope? Is it limited to the Mediterranean basin? And how, it's funny, with pike and shot, for example, you see people using those rules to do 15th and 14th century battles. And then you see Silk Road expansions that try to stretch it into eastern parts of the world. How broad can you get in terms of time period?
The time period at the moment, like I say, is from 105 BC through to about 200 AD. So at the moment, we've got inside the main rule book, we've got 10 different historical scenarios, mostly from the 1st century BC. But also we've got 20 different army lists inside it, which would give you some suggestions on how to sort of recreate those particular armies so that they look roughly historically plausible, at least anyway. So they're based around really Rome and the enemies of Rome inside that time period there. So at the moment, no, there's no Han Chinese or whatever that many people enjoy playing with. It very much is inside the Roman world at this point in time. So it's not going to Mesoamerican conflicts or sub-Saharan Africa or into Asia with this at all. It very much is the Roman world. So we've got a whole range of different armies there, several different Roman armies, Sertorian Spanish, for example, and then Numidians, Gauls, Germans, sort of Italian tribes from social wars, Illyrians, Parthians, Armenians, Judean revolts, Dacians. I think I've done most of the big ones in there. There's a few I had to miss out purely because of space in the book there. There's no Sarmatians at the moment for my, which probably is a bit of a bigger mission, really. And we've got I'm going to pronounce this again badly. I'm going to call them Nubians is probably the best phrase to describe them because I can't pronounce the other word beginning with B to describe them. But yeah, people from sort of south of Egypt, from the Sudan sort of area there, who obviously sort of came into conflict in the time of Augustus. So there's a few little groups like that I sort of ought to really cover to make it truly comprehensive that time period there. But I think most of them you could probably proxy in one of the other army lists and use that if you wanted to. I don't know, I suppose you could probably use Parthians or something as a basis for a Sarmatian force there. You might need to tweak it a little tiny bit, but you get the idea of the sort of the different troop types inside it there. And I think probably if you're imaginative and you know your history, you can probably use the army list to make your own armies and be creative.
I imagine you will be delighted when fans inevitably make it their own and you get your first Shang Chinese expansion or you get your first Mesoamerican conflict.
The very first thing wargamers like to do is they like to say, oh, this is fantastic, but would these work for? And they come up with something else completely different and you think to yourself, no, I've spent the last 2 years making this around this period here deliberately, so it really captures this type of warfare. And they think, oh, will it be appropriate for, I don't know, 30 years war? Because I like it, and you're thinking you've never even played the game yet, and yet still you want to apply this to 30 Years War. And of course, I'm sure it will play and it would be a fun game, but whether or not actually it really captures the nature of warfare and really whether or not there's enough similarity in the way in which, a general would go about their business, I suspect you probably need to do quite a lot of work to actually adapt it. And also, why would you want to adapt Strength and Honor for that when it's specifically based around that Roman world, when there's some very, very good rule sets out there designed specifically for much more specialist periods later on or before. So, much as I like my rules and I found them good fun, I do find it quite a funny thing for wargamers to want to sort of apply them to just about every single period.
Strength and armor battles for Mars.
Yeah, well, you say that, but somebody straight away said, "Oh, I'm going to play this with Lord of the Rings." They said, and I thought, right, okay.
I thought Mars was, keeps it very much within the Roman setting,
the Roman world. Yeah,
absolutely,
possibly,
absolutely.
Yeah,
I think it certainly can go backwards easily. You can go into the 2nd century BC and even into the 3rd century BC.
The plan for it, Murray, is to go back and do earlier Roman conflicts there. And everybody's desperate to do Carthage and Rome, and deliberately I haven't looked at I haven't covered the earlier sort of Polybian sort of style legions. Although I've worked out how to play them. We play tested them quite a bit actually, so they're going to be coming out later on in another supplement later on.
I was going to ask supplement
yeah,
city.
That's the plan.
Jasper, do we want to specifically ask the questions? Because I think we've answered most of them in our.
I think we've
chat.
answered most of them, and also time is getting a little bit short. So I think if people want to learn more about Strength and Honor, I know that there's quite an extensive series of videos on YouTube about it. See what Mark looks like, and what the game really looks like on the table. Because I think for people who've never seen a miniature war game, it might be interesting to see. A setup. It's a diorama that moves slowly, and
it moves quickly, Jasper. Not like your big figures.
Oh, sorry.
Well,
sorry.
Also, and it's important. And I think one of the things that Strength and Honor does differently than almost any other game I've seen. Look, 2mm is an unusual scale. Most war games are played at 1/7 28mm. And one of the things I've waxed eloquently on this podcast before is that I like 6mm because it's the theater of the mind. Obviously, it's not 1-to-1, but it's giving you a vision of just how massive these things really were. And that is one thing that Strength and Honor does quite well. And that's very different, in my opinion, than most war games on the market. So it really is worth watching YouTube videos and getting a sense of those visuals.
Well, it does play in 6mm too. So I'm painting on as we speak.
But that's for another video, Mark.
Yeah.
Or podcast. All right. Thank you very much for joining us. And I hope people found it interesting, a slightly different take on our usual podcast. And we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.